As a late bloomer whose life didn't really start until my mid-30s, I used to think that there was something inherently wrong with me. No matter how hard I worked towards creating a better life for myself, there was always some invisible force holding me back behind all of my peers. It took me far too many decades to realize that sometimes the people closest to us are actually our most dangerous enemies, and unfortunately for me, that very person was my own father. This is my story about how my narcissistic dad controlled every aspect of my life to serve his own desires until I finally took my power back in order to blossom into the woman that my soul came here to be. Before we hop into this video, I want to add that the stories I'm about to share are simply to help paint the picture of some of the things that I experienced growing up and how those experiences shaped me into the person that I used to be before my healing journey. If you're easily triggered by abusive experiences, including sexual assault, I would not recommend watching this video. This is not about blaming my parents or anyone from my past, nor do I encourage anyone who watches this video to blame anyone from their personal experiences either. Blaming others keeps us trapped in victimhood, and the point of this video is to empower anyone who relates to liberate themselves from their past and reflect on how people's behavior, parents or not, may have negatively impacted you and the way in which you navigate life. I'm sharing my own story in hopes to shed light for anyone who's gone through similar experiences, and offer ways that can help you heal from your past, show up to life in a new way, and ultimately become the version of yourself that you were destined to be. My dad was someone that I genuinely looked up to throughout my life. Growing up in a household with an overtly narcissistic mother who was constantly yelling, swearing, and acting borderline psychotic, I had always believed that my dad was the safer of my two parents. He was a timid, soft-spoken, non-confrontational man who never raised his voice. And for the longest time, I was fully convinced that I had the greatest dad that a girl could ever ask for. I believed that no one on the entire face of the earth could ever love me as much as he did. I saw him as my very best friend. However, my dad was just as bad, if not worse, than my mother. At least her abuse was obvious, as his was far more insidious. He not only enabled my mother's abusive behavior towards me, but he always painted himself out to be the helpless victim when he had all the power as an adult to remove me from that situation. Instead of protecting me like a parent is supposed to, he kept his head buried in the sand, and he taught me through his own example that everyone is more powerful than me, and that it's my responsibility to just keep the peace with abusive people, even when it's not in my best interest to do so. No healthy adult with a sound mind would ever just sit back and watch their own child be abused by someone, let alone the child's other parent. He was always more concerned with protecting himself over keeping me safe. It wasn't until my parents got divorced when I was 12 that I slowly started to see that he wasn't exactly the man he portrayed himself to be. Not only was he constantly complaining about my mother and dumping all of his emotional baggage onto me, but he completely relinquished all of his responsibilities as a father and started abusing me worse than my mother did the moment he had me all to himself. Every day I was expected to cook dinner for him, my grandma, and myself, do the dishes, clean the house, dust his room for him, fold his laundry and put it away, mow approximately 16 hours worth of lawn every week, weed his gigantic garden, write up contracts and legal documents for his and my uncle's business, give him back and leg massages before bed, and anything else that he wanted in the exact moment of which he demanded it. He wasn't simply teaching me how to do things around the house, he was using me as a means to getting his own needs and desires met. I was both parentified and infantilized simultaneously. I had to mother my dad while abandoning my own childhood, yet he also wanted me to stay his little girl for the rest of my life. He always expected me to do everything that a wife would do, yet I had no basic rights to be my own person. I always had this unsettling feeling around my dad. When we moved in with my grandma, I spent all of my teenage years begging him for a bedroom door. He would constantly invade my privacy by tiptoeing into my room when I was unaware of his presence, and sneak up behind me to kiss me on the cheeks and touch my neck inappropriately. It always creeped me out, and every time I pleaded with him to stop, he would say, "Stop acting like your mother. I'm your daddy. I'm allowed to do whatever I want to you." First off, when someone, even your own parent, touches you in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable and still continues to do so even after you voice a boundary with them, that is physical abuse. And a lot of our culture seems to think that just because they made that child, it gives them the right to do whatever they want to them, but it doesn't. Anyone who acts in this way is abusing their power as a parent. In my experience, the only thing that this taught me was that my voice didn't matter, and that if somebody wanted to do something to me, that I was just supposed to let them. And I'm sure, as you can imagine, that way of thinking definitely got me into some terrifying situations with men throughout my life. As time went on, our dynamic only became more toxic. He would make comments about my body from time to time, and even one of my exes caught him creepily checking me out on several occasions whenever I was doing dishes, cooking, or any other random thing around the house whenever my back was turned to him. He'd constantly point out whenever he found a woman attractive, and I'm not talking about a simple acknowledgement of their beauty. He would be blatantly inappropriate as if I were one of his buddies. I also asked him hundreds of times to stop watching sexual-related movies and TV shows when I was around because it made me horrifically uncomfortable. He never once respected this boundary and instead would get aroused right in front of me and brush it off by saying, "Oh, it's not that bad." My feelings were constantly dismissed, which only discouraged me from speaking up for myself. As I got older, the endless list of responsibilities continued to pile up even more. Not only was I constantly running errands for my dad on a daily basis, but I also had to frequently request time off from work in order to bring my grandma to all of her doctor's appointments and even foot expensive vet bills for one of our dogs who kept getting into porcupines because my dad didn't feel that it was necessary to get the hundreds of quills removed from the inside of his mouth and throat. By the time I turned 19, I wound up draining the rest of my savings account after my dad begged and guilt-tripped me for months to let him and my uncle borrow thousands of dollars to help them get their restaurant up and running. I wasn't paid back until 8 years later in painstakingly slow $50 and $100 increments over the course of 4 years. My well-being was never a factor of concern for him. In fact, anytime I said no or tried to set boundaries in order to protect myself, he would just double down and make sure I felt extremely bad for giving him a hard time. He would say things like, "Don't you want to make your daddy happy?" Or, "After everything I've done for you and you can't just do this one thing for me?" Or he would just straight up threaten my basic needs in order to get me to do it anyway. And just to give some context here, my dad works for himself building houses with my uncle, and for a few short years they ran a restaurant 2 separate times together. So it's not like he had a demanding job that made it impossible for him to be able to take care of his own responsibilities. He's just an incredibly immature and irresponsible person who spends all of his free time gambling his money away at the casino and racking up insane amounts of debt instead of making responsible choices and saving up for his own future in retirement. When the restaurant opened for the first time, I was already working a full-time job on top of running 2 brand new businesses of my own. Despite the fact that I was already making a really good living for myself, he not only begged me to come work for them, but he made it a point to try and knock my confidence down by telling me that photography wasn't a real job and that I wasn't going to be able to go very far with it. He loved instilling me with negative beliefs about myself and what I was capable of doing, so that I would think that he always knew better than me. Like all narcissistic parents, my dad's personal agenda was always above my own, and he didn't care what kind of manipulation tactics he needed to use to make sure that I keep complying with his requests. I was never a person to him. I was his possession. It's funny how when the tables turned and I was in need of his help, I was always told to figure it out. For instance, I used to drive an Oldsmobile that had something wrong with the electrical system. I could be driving 65 miles an hour down the highway, and suddenly the steering wheel and pedals would lock up, and I would have to quickly maneuver it to the side of the road before someone came along and hit me. It would take hours, sometimes even days, before the car would decide to turn back on. One night it happened while I was turning onto a busy intersection in the middle of a snowstorm, and if it wasn't for the extremely nice couple who got out and helped me push it into a parking lot, I would have gotten hit by oncoming traffic. I called my dad as soon as I took off, and all he said was, "I don't know what to tell you. You're gonna have to just sit there and wait until it turns back on." Mind you, he was about 5 miles away, eating dinner and watching TV, while I sat in that car freezing my ass off for almost 4 hours before it finally started back up and I was able to drive home. No matter what it was, I always had to figure shit out on my own. Yet the moment someone else needed his help, he would drop everything in an instant to run to their rescue. And if that wasn't frustrating enough, every time I tried to open up to him about something that I was struggling with, he would just say, "Well, how do you think I feel?" Then rattle off all the things that were bothering him and make the conversation about himself. It was as if I was never allowed to talk about my own experiences, and I always wound up feeling a million times worse after opening up to him. I always felt completely invisible in his presence. He never tried to see me for who I truly was, and always got upset anytime I expressed my own thoughts, ideas, and opinions. Rather than teach me to embrace my authenticity, he expected me to become a carbon copy of himself. Having such an enmeshed and codependent relationship with my dad caused me to become a people pleaser who accepted abuse as love from literally everyone who crossed my path. Mothering my dad all those years trained me to mother all of the other adults in my life, especially romantic partners and friends. The only way I saw myself as having value was by playing this caretaker role and constantly overgiving without ever receiving the same love and support in return. I never spoke my truth or stood up for myself whenever I felt hurt or taken advantage of. Instead, I would try even harder to gain their love and approval, which only made my connections more lopsided. And since I never had the opportunity to truly know myself, I would always match the temperature of every room I walked into and became the person I thought people wanted me to be in order to make them happy. This only took me further away from embodying my authenticity and perpetuated a deep feeling of loneliness, even in a crowded room. I constantly felt like a victim in every situation that I found myself in, and was wildly confused as to why, no matter what I did or who I surrounded myself with, I still felt completely unsatisfied with my life. Eventually, I moved back home when I was 27, after the really abusive relationship that I shared about in chapters 1 and 7. It was the first time in what felt like forever that I could finally let my guard down. I was extremely grateful to have a safe space to get my life back on track, especially since it was only a handful of months after my spiritual awakening began, and I started realizing how completely misaligned my entire life was back then. At first, everything seemed great. I fell into a new routine, started healing from my past and getting to know myself on a deeper level, spent more time doing the things that I loved, and even got my photography career back up and running greater than ever before. But unfortunately, that momentum didn't last for very long. Over the following several years, every time I started to get ahead in life, my dad would inevitably trample in like a bull in a china shop, demanding that I give him every ounce of my time and energy. He had an extraordinary level of entitlement, and my entire life revolved around prioritizing all of his needs, wants, and desires 24/7. I was never asked, but expected to drop anything and everything, including my own work, in order to serve him at the drop of a hat. Whether it was performing tasks around the house, mowing the lawn, cooking him dinner, running a million errands a day, or draining my bank account, he made me responsible for his well-being while completely turning a blind eye to the effect that his behavior was having on my life. He spent years charging things to my credit cards, including subscriptions to dating sites, and not paying me back for months at a time, and never pitching in any extra to pay for interest that kept racking up. Every day he would have some kind of absurd request, like driving all the way to their job site within minutes of him demanding that I bring them Gatorades when there was a gas station not even a quarter mile up the road from them. Or the time that I was out eating lunch with a friend and he begged me to hurry up and get back home so that I could pick him up from the pavilion out behind the house, which is about a 2.5-minute walk, because he didn't want to get his hair wet in the rain. No matter what it was, he would exclaim, "I don't care how you feel or what you have going on. I need this done right now." 99% of the time, I would just comply so that he wouldn't get mad at me, and I rarely, if ever, received a thank you in return. Then the 1% of time that I couldn't do something for him, he would get pissed off at me and give me the silent treatment for extended periods of time, which would throw my people-pleasing tendencies into overdrive in order to regain the breadcrumbs of his love. He knew exactly what buttons to push to maintain control over me because he was the one who installed them. Eventually in 2018, I went no contact with my mother, which I shared great detail about in Chapter 5. My dad supported my decision, knowing how badly that she had always treated me. And although my parents had already been divorced for about 16 years by that point, he would still complain about my mother and how she was this evil villain who destroyed his life. He blamed every single problem he's ever had on her, even though she had no part in creating them. Rather than face his problems head on, he would always let them get worse and conveniently paint himself out to be this helpless victim who could never catch a break in life. My dad brainwashed me for decades into believing that he saved me when my parents got divorced. He put himself on such a high pedestal within my mind that once his mask began to slip and I started to see just how toxic of a person he really was, he came crashing down from such high heights that it shattered every bit of illusions I ever had about him. I realized that his only objective in my life was to turn me into an extension of himself so that I would focus on serving him while abandoning myself and my own aspirations in life. Anytime I expressed my desires, he would immediately say, "Yeah, I'm not crazy about you doing that." Or if I talked about my plans for the future, like moving out of state, he would say, "You can't leave me. What am I supposed to do when you're gone?" I had to constantly amputate parts of my personality in order to fit into this person that he wanted me to be. He would pretend like he was just looking out for me, but really his overprotectiveness was actually control in disguise. He would often remind me about how much he loved me back when I was 4 years old, and that no matter how old I got, even when I was in my 30s, he still wanted me to call him Daddy and act the same way that I did back then. He never once tried to get to know me as an adult woman, and his refusal to see and accept me as someone with my own thoughts and personality only further drove a wedge between us as time went on. All throughout my life, he literally wished it upon me to not move out until I was in my 30s. He affirmed it so much that it actually came true. And not only that, but he loved shaming me for the fact that I still didn't have my life on track, as if it were something that he found pleasure in. The funny thing is that he never actually tried to help me get ahead in life at all. Instead, he hindered me at every single turn in order to keep me under his thumb. Eventually, I ended up moving out to the tiny hunting cabin that my dad and uncle built, which is situated on the property behind the barn of the house that I grew up in. It was by far one of the biggest blessings that I had ever received by that point in my life, because not only did I still not have a bedroom door at 30 years old despite asking for one every birthday and Christmas, but the entire house was crawling with black mold and most of the ceilings leaked, including the one in my room. I was sick and tired of living in such gross conditions and never having any privacy, so I made a deal with them and told them that the second that they sold the cabin, I would immediately move out that day. The cabin not only provided a space of sanctuary, but it also served as a safe place away from my dad so that I could finally focus on getting my life and career back on track. Although I was extremely fortunate to not have to pay to live in the cabin, it still came at a pretty hefty price of many of my family members hating me and seeing me as entitled. It also allowed my dad to look like the amazing and generous guy that he always portrayed himself to be, and he also got to hold it over my head as another means to control me. One day, my dad and uncle told me that they sold the cabin and that I needed to move out by the end of the week. I immediately bursted into tears because I was already going through some heavy stuff at the time, so this just sent me over the edge. They both stood there smiling from ear to ear, and I walked off into the woods to let myself fall apart. About 30 minutes later, my dad appeared between the trees and said, "You don't need to cry, we were just kidding. We just wanted to see your reaction." This should already go without saying, but for those of you who don't understand, this is textbook bully behavior. If someone is purposely doing or saying something to a person with the intention to inflict emotional pain or get a negative reaction out of them, they are being a bully. This is a pattern that my dad has carried out throughout my entire life. He's always gone out of his way to purposely hurt my feelings and elicit specific emotional reactions out of me for his own pleasure and enjoyment. I justified my dad's actions for years in order to maintain our relationship in hopes that we could eventually heal our dynamic. But all I was really doing was gaslighting myself and protecting him from ever having to take accountability for all the ways that he mistreated me. Things with my dad only got worse as time went on. In October of 2021, I landed one of my dream photography jobs, the kind of job that took me all 13 years to finally get. So I was riding some serious confidence, ready to land more opportunities just like it. But as always, the moment my career started to get me to new heights, my dad would come in and pull me off track quicker than the speed of light. After an unusual tornado that touched down in upstate New York, my dad and uncle wound up rebuilding a steeple for a local church. One of our distant cousins was already working on painting all the boards, beams, and trim for it, but according to them, he wasn't doing a good enough job. My dad begged me for days until I reluctantly agreed to help them because I literally could not take any more of his agonizing guilt tripping. The following morning, he came bursting through the cabin door, demanding that I stop everything that I was doing and get to painting because they needed the tongue and groove boards finished by the weekend. Mind you, that was not at all a week-long job. I ended up painting from morning until night, 6 days a week for well over a month in order to get my part finished just in time for them to start assembling it. I spent so much time and energy focusing on helping them that I didn't even get any new work lined up for myself to carry me through the winter. I literally begged my dad to give me more work so that I could pay my bills on time. I wound up staining his brand new butcher shop for $20 an hour, plus cleaning and decluttering his house from top to bottom, until I eventually pinched my sciatic nerve and got laid up for over 6 weeks, taking me even further off of my own path. By the end of January, I had no choice but to ask my dad if I could borrow money from him in order to pay my bills since I was still unable to walk or even sit upright comfortably. His response was, "Of course, you're my world. That's what I'm here for. I'll do anything for you. If you need my help for the next 6 months to a year, I can help you until you get back on your feet. Whatever you need." But as soon as I was hooked into his financial grip and was up and walking again, he tried to guilt trip me into working off the money that he let me borrow by cleaning the house and doing anything else that he asked of me for $20 an hour. Mind you, the whole point of me borrowing money was so that I had time to get back on my feet, not make it completely impossible for myself to get back to a state of independence and self-reliance. As uncomfortable as it was, I very calmly explained to him that working off all that money I owed him for $20 an hour would literally take me years and I had no intentions on doing that. I told him that the less he asked of my time and energy, the quicker that I could get back on my feet and pay him back in cash. Of course, he lashed out on me and hit me with the classic, "You know, I've sacrificed so much for you," as if I asked to be born. "You owe it to me to help me out," as if I didn't help him out a billion times throughout my life and put myself in compromising positions in order to save him. 2 weeks later, just a few days before my bills were due, he gave me less than half of what I needed to cover my bills without any warning or heads up that I was going to have to find another way. He told me that he wasn't going to help me any longer and said, I had to struggle, so do you. You can go push grocery carts at Walmart for $17 an hour for all I care. Keep in mind that there were plenty of times that he didn't have any work lined up for months on end, and I was always there to support him whenever he needed it without ever shaming him. Now that the tables were turned, he did everything in his power to ensure that I would remain powerless and completely under his control. And to be clear, it's not the fact that he stopped helping me, it's the fact that he decided to stop helping me last minute without any warning, putting me in an even more detrimental position. I should have known that this would eventually happen, since he was always absent in my most critical moments of need. And for the fact that he was never supportive of my career choices and was always undermining me by trying to force me into doing things that he deemed worthy of my time and energy. I literally had no one else to turn to for help at that point in my life, as I was going through a breakup and letting go of friends after seeing their true colors. So I ended up DoorDashing for a while, sold and pawned most of my belongings, cashed out a bunch of random stuff like bonds from childhood, as well as my 401k and an HSA account from an old job, and literally anything else that I could liquefy in order to stay afloat. After this whole debacle, I started setting much stronger boundaries around my time and energy, and of course I got a lot of pushback. First, I started off by explaining exactly why it was important for me to set boundaries, with which my dad replied, well, can't you just set them with everyone else but me? And I said, no, you are the main reason that I need to get better at setting boundaries. You literally taught me to let everyone walk all over me, including yourself. Then he was saying things like, it was so much easier when you were a kid. Yeah, because I was easy to manipulate and you had full control over me. And eventually he started threatening to take his own life, like he's done on several other occasions before, by saying, if you ever cut me off like you did with your mother, I would just go out back and shoot myself. I would have no reason to live. All his behavior did was just shed light on how incredibly toxic and immature he was, and pushed me into feeling levels of anger that I had never experienced before. I realized that I wasted literal decades of my life pouring into his black hole of needs. And no matter how many times he tried to cross my boundaries and get me to do what he wanted, I was done being an extension of him and throwing my own life away in the process. At the beginning of August, once Cody and I established a relationship, I wound up living with him in Washington for a few months. This was one of the most healing things that could have possibly happened for me at that time because we cannot heal in the environment that traumatized us. Being on the opposite side of the country as my dad gave me the space to finally calm my nervous system down enough to catch my breath and start processing everything that unfolded throughout the beginning of that year. If you haven't listened to some of my earlier stories from this series, it's important to mention that I'm very connected spiritually and receive a ton of support from the divine. One day in September, I finally got confirmation as to why I always felt extremely unsafe around my dad, specifically afraid that he would try to do something sexually to me. My ancestors showed me a vision of something that my dad had done to me when I was a baby. I was shocked, mortified, and yet at the same time, not totally surprised. After a few days of processing what I was shown, I started connecting dots and remembered a specific Lifetime movie that the two of us watched back in January while I was laid up on the couch for 6 weeks. It was about a controlling father who locked his daughter in the soundproof bomb shelter once he caught wind of her plans to move out of state when she turned 18. As soon as the daughter realized that she was trapped in her own basement, my dad changed the channel. I asked, "Why did you change it?" And he said, "Oh, I already watched this movie a couple weeks ago." I thought to myself, where the fuck is this movie going? At this point, I wanted to investigate what exactly he voluntarily watched, so I said, "I was just getting into the story. I want to see what happens next." He turned it back, and to my absolute horror, this man ends up assaulting his own daughter countless times over the span of 20 years, and she gave birth to a bunch of his children before eventually escaping. I remember thinking to myself how strange it was that my dad had already watched the movie in its entirety when he's mentioned countless times to me that if anyone ever assaulted me that he would kill them, yet looking back, he actually watched a lot of movies with women being assaulted right in front of me, even as a child. Not to mention the fact that I had actually shared some of my experiences of being assaulted by men with my dad, yet he barely bat an eye and even reacted very apathetically, as if it weren't that big of a deal. I didn't share any of this insight with him at the time, but I definitely took note of it. Once I returned back home from Washington a couple months later, I asked him if he had ever molested me or touched me inappropriately when I was little. He closed his eyes and dramatically swayed his head side to side and goes, "Your mother would kill me if she ever found out something like that." What does my mother have to do with anything that I just asked you? It's a yes or no answer. Then he immediately starts filling the awkward silence with a bunch of words and trying to change the subject. I knew the second he responded that he was lying to me. But again, I kept it to myself for my own protection and made him think that I believed him. By that point, I had already reached a level within my spiritual journey where I can no longer be fooled by people's lies. Whether it's directly to my face or not, I can always tell when someone's lying to me. And not only that, but their lies are always confirmed through my dream space, and sometimes, just like in this instance, it will be shown to me several times in order for me to truly accept that my trust in a particular person is no longer appropriate. Eventually, I came across a book called The Emotional Incest Syndrome: What to Do When a Parent's Love Rules Your Life. It talks about growing up with an invasive parent who sends mixed messages of love, neglect, and abuse simultaneously. It also explores how these toxic dynamics negatively affects other family members involved, and goes into great detail on how to repair these dynamics, if both parties are willing, of course, as well as how to have healthier relationships of any kind overall. It really explained and validated the complicated relationship that I had with my dad, and even helped me to better understand how I've related to everyone else throughout my life. The simplest way to describe emotional incest without getting too far in the weeds is when a parent puts their unmet emotional needs onto their child and treats them like a replacement of their spouse and even their adult friend, therapist, or counselor. The child grows up completely unprepared for adulthood because they were raised to be the desired person that the parent wanted them to be instead of their authentic self. And for me, my dad treated me like I was his wife, mother, caregiver, secretary, therapist, masseuse, maid, and ranch hand all rolled into one. He grew me from the time that I was born to take care of him and all of his needs. This dynamic didn't allow me to have the proper time, space, or boundaries to ever discover my true self or pursue my own life, resulting in arrested development, codependency, and enmeshment. This book made me realize that I already did everything that I could to try and repair this relationship. As soon as my spiritual awakening began in 2016 and I started doing really deep internal work around my past traumas, I shared everything that I was learning with him. All of the epiphanies that I had around the links between certain experiences and relationships from my past and how those negatively impacted me, and I even shed tons of light on the things that him and I could work on together to form a better relationship. But no matter how many times I tried to get through to him, as soon as he was clued into the fact that he wasn't this perfect dad that he convinced himself that he was, he no longer wanted to hear anything about my healing journey or have any part in building a healthier connection with me. He felt that him being my dad automatically dismissed all the psychological and emotional damage that he inflicted upon me, and believed that if he ignored everything that I brought up, it would eventually just go away by itself. He was more dedicated to being seen as the victim than taking accountability, and just wanted things to go back to the way that they used to be when he had full control over me. Considering my dad kicked me when I was at my lowest points in life, I decided that I was no longer going to abandon myself to try to maintain a relationship with someone who was committed to misunderstanding me. I recognized that I owed it to myself to finally protect my well-being, and that the only thing that really mattered was that I took responsibility for the position I found myself in life and finally made major changes in order to move into a better place within myself and within the world. I had to stop seeing myself as a victim and take my power back. I wasn't the one who put myself in that position, but I knew that I was the only one that was going to get me out of it. In order to heal my father wound, I had to stop trying to get him to see and love me and finally give that love and validation to myself. I had to grieve both the expectations I had around the kind of relationship that I wished we had, as well as grieve the truth of our connection and what actually happened. I eventually came to terms with the fact that I would never have the parents that I wished that I could have had, and became that parent to myself. I worked on my self-worth and confidence, started embodying more of my authenticity, stood up for myself every chance that I got, and stopped sharing my personal business with him. Anytime he asked questions that I didn't want to give him answers to, I would straight up tell him that it was none of his business and that he lost the privilege of knowing me. I also had to be very conscious of not accepting gifts from him, as literally everything he ever offered me always came with a million strings attached. Even something as small and simple as a piece of candy, as soon as I accepted anything from him, he would immediately follow it up by asking me for a bunch of favors. After a while, I noticed that the only time he ever acknowledged my existence and talked to me was when he wanted one of three things: to get me to validate his feelings, to do something for him, or to criticize me to get a reaction out of me for his own enjoyment. Eventually, he stopped trying to fish for those reactions the moment that I stopped acting like a shrinking violet. And as soon as I stopped doing things for him, somehow he magically stayed on top of his own responsibilities for the very first time in his life. It's as if he were always capable of it and just used my giving nature for his own benefit. Serving my dad 24/7 led me to having absolutely nothing to show for myself other than being stuck living at home with him until I was 35 years old. The only way I dug myself out of the hole that he put me in was to follow my intuition, take direction from my ancestors in spirit, develop my faith to be stronger than my fears, and moved in complete silence until I had enough resources to finally escape. Going no contact with a parent is a decades-long process. As humans, we are hardwired to do everything in our power to gain the love and approval of our parents. But no amount of fulfilling every one of my dad's needs, wants, or desires ever got me either of those things from him. No matter how many attempts I made to heal our relationship, nothing ever changed. He had every chance in the world to fix things, but he chose his pride instead. I didn't go no contact with my dad to punish him. I did it to stop punishing myself. He abandoned me way before I abandoned him, and going no contact was the only option left for me in order to protect my own well-being. Having a father like him felt like a prison sentence. My desire for freedom and independence is what kept me motivated throughout this entire experience. And although he may have stolen the first 35 years of my life, I'm finally in charge of how I get to spend all the rest of my years ahead of me. Everyone has experienced some level of trauma throughout their lives, and my dad was no different. I know that he grew up with parents who parentified him and his 5 siblings, making them work on the farm when they were kids and tending their bars as teenagers and all kinds of inappropriate things. So I understand why my dad was the way that he was. However, that doesn't excuse his refusal to try to do better as a parent, especially once he was presented with new information that allowed him to show up in a healthier way. I like to believe that most people are trying to do their best, but some people really just refuse to look at themselves and how their actions negatively impact the people around them. My dad refused to take accountability anytime I brought something up, and he never changed his behavior to ensure that he didn't hurt me again. Instead, he betrayed me over and over without showing any remorse. People who actually love and care about you will protect you from pain, not be the cause of it. I didn't grow up with role models. I grew up with people that I didn't want to be like. My experience with both of my parents taught me that just because you have the ability to have kids doesn't mean that you should. Too many people wind up having children simply because they feel pressured to live up to societal expectations without ever really considering whether or not it's something they actually want. Parenthood is a choice, not a requirement. I genuinely commend people who know themselves deeply enough to recognize and honor the fact that they don't want kids, just as I equally commend people who are actively working on themselves to become healthier adults in order to be a better parent than the ones that they grew up with, whether they already have kids or plan to do so in the future. Trauma is intergenerational. Whatever we don't look at and heal within our own experience automatically gets passed down to the next generation, and so on and so forth. I don't believe that parents need to be perfect, but they do need to be self-aware and capable of leading a good enough example for their children to grow up into healthy, mature, and responsible adults who are able to thrive in the real world. To me, parenting is by far the most important and sacred role that anyone could take on because you are quite literally contributing towards building the future of this planet. I hope as a collective that we can start to change the conversation from how could you cut off your own parent to what actions and behaviors led you to making the difficult decision to go no contact. If you wouldn't stay in an abusive relationship with a partner, why would you let it slide with a parent? We may not get to choose the family that we're born into, but we do get to choose who deserves to be a part of our life.